Welcome back to the Housing Sector Podcast. Thank you very much indeed. Let's get this out of the way. Like, subscribe. Apparently it helps. Follow along. Today I am talking to Hannah, who is currently with DataClan as a consultant, but has worked for Home Group and a large national provider. And it's good to get both sides of the story. And I'm always happy to have conversations with people from different ponds. Let's find out. The only way we can have these conversations is if they're open and honest. And the only way we can support housing and improve housing is by having open and honest conversations. So this one's close to my heart. Hannah, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me.
We're going to start the ball rolling because on a blog that's going to go out this week, so it'll probably be already out now, this podcast is going out, around service charge and the lack of insight into it. And not only, I've provided some Freedom of Information Act to councils, and the councils have come back and said, yeah, we pay millions and we don't really check it. No, which has worried me because we know the service isn't being provided. And we know that when it's interrogated too closely, it doesn't quite stack up. Hannah, am I jumping on a bandwagon here? Have I got it wrong? Is service charges secure and fixed, or are they just wild figures floating around there?
I think you're definitely onto something, Ben. I sit here with my own service charge bill on my desk, and it's doubled in about 3 years. I think it's something I've sat on many investment panels, and it's been the number one thing that's always bothered me. I think development teams will obviously have a project to deliver. They don't stay around to see the long-term impact of the service charges. And you've got people buying property who take it on face value, what the sales teams give them. And the sales teams have to take it on face value from what the managing agents present the developers or the housing associations present their customers. Well, we see it in the press. We've got a whole batch of reform from the government because service charges just keep spiraling. They're going up, and we're told it's insurance, we're told it's this. But mine isn't going up for insurance. It's going up because the pumps failed. That's a 3-year-old pump. So I think the scrutiny has to be there, and it has to be there at multiple stages of the asset life. And I just don't think it's happening.
Is it because we're building these homes too cheap, and we're getting the government grants and we're going off, and there's build baby build, which is now sounds like it should be turning into grab baby grab. We're building these houses so cheap, and they're not built to last. They're not dry. We've got problems with damp, and then regulation comes in. Then we have a fire, and regulation comes in, and we have to tighten up our fire doors. Is the legislation so low that they're allowed to build them so cheap and almost encouraged to? And then 3-5 years down the line, we're going, well, actually, we've misjudged that.
I think it's definitely been a race to the bottom. I think that the margins, if you talk to any of the house builders, developers, the margins are always tight. There's huge amounts of risk. Whether sites should ever have been taken into development in the first place. And it comes back to that viability, doesn't it? If you're not properly scrutinising it, you probably wouldn't build it. But people want to build, the government's pushing it. But I think it comes back to when like I look at my house, I think you saw my LinkedIn post about the construction team telling me, just talk to aftercare about that, without a kind of any like recognition that actually they were responsible for the quality control. And now it's an aftercare issue that I haven't got insulation in my walls. So I think margins are tight. People aren't being truthful about the actual cost to build. The quality isn't there. The quality controls. I think people take the number of times, even after Grenfell, I was told it's got a building control certificate, and it hasn't. And I had properties being handed over to me, and I've always been at that sort of stage of handover. When I haven't been in control of the development phase, I've had to sort of take what's given to me at handover stage. And I have fond memories of a colleague from a few years ago where she and I really locked horns because she kept saying to me, but it's practically complete. You've got a practical completion certificate. And I said, I've got a fire risk assessment that's telling me I've got all these hazards. I can't occupy this. So your development appraisal looks great, but I'm not going to hit your sales targets. So and I think that's the problem. People don't realise the knock-on. And the truth is, to actually build quality in the markets that we're in, does cost money. So actually, is everybody kidding themselves? Are we going to get these 1.5 million homes? Probably not without something being compromised.
Yeah, and we've had Dan Bruce and his partner on, and they're in a luxury apartment in London, and it's the same thing. It's just not
Yeah.
safe, and now they're having to sue them and go to court. Do you think also that service charges, there's been, when everything's affordable and we're all got a bit of cash in our back pocket, it's a bill, we pay it and it goes, it's not been a problem. Do you think as we're sort of caught in this cost crisis epidemic that we're in now, people are starting to review these figures a bit closer, and as housing associations are putting them up, there is a spotlight on them.
Yeah.
And from the information I've gotten back from my own landlord and from these freedom of information requests, it's, well, we put it up by 15% every year. We're allowed to do that. So we do, that's what happens. But the service is now being judged against what we're paying. Do you
Yeah.
think there's a more eyes are on it now because it's gotten too expensive?
Definitely. I think we saw it with Michael Gove and the leasehold reform. We're seeing it sort of trickle into, I mean, I don't know if it's the algorithms and, LinkedIn and my Alexa apps listening to me, but it's certainly, I'm seeing it become more and more prevalent in what people are talking about. I mean, mine has doubled. I can still afford to pay it, but if you're on a fixed income, so retirees, if you're in social housing, you're financially vulnerable. You cannot afford to just incur these shocks. In fact, who should just have somebody send them a bill that's doubled? I mean, that's just madness. It shows that something's gone wrong. And so, yes, there needs to be more scrutiny. There needs to be more challenge. And I think it's about fairness. It's not about, some people, where I live, we've set up a little residents association, and it's generally been driven by people who have most time on their hands, but also, and they have said, well, it doesn't affect us. And I said, yeah, but it affects me. It affects people who, don't have that disposable income, and its principle as well. So yeah, I do. It needs to be scrutinised. And you might be aware that the government have introduced the social tenant access to information requests. I think that's coming in
Stairs, yes.
stairs. Yeah, basically a freedom of information request for housing associations. And I think that's it's going to be quite a difficult policy to comply with for housing associations until they get to a point where they're actually able to report at the most granular level of what they're doing on their properties and why. And it's driving that transparency. But I think your freedom of information request was targeted at the local authorities who
Well,
say,
yeah, I have gone to the local authority, the councils, and that's coming back. And I've also used it with my own landlord, and I'm absolutely amazed at what they discuss openly across email. And now they have closed meetings, but it was shocking, the first response and the first batch of information I got. And the fact that you would see issues just pass from department. It's not us, it's building services or
yeah,
property management, just like a hot potato. But
yeah.
so what is these stairs, social tenant access information? Are they in play yet? Can we use them? I say, are the social tenant access information requests, are they in play yet? Can we use them?
Not yet. I think they land in October. So I think the Housing Ombudsman is consulting on them. So anybody that's interested should look at that and respond. They require, so landlords need to publish that they exist. They need to basically say, look, we are required to give you this information and you have a right to ask us for it. And the information could be around how their governance operates, who's making the decisions, what controls are in place, what expenditure can go through without, levels of kind of scrutiny. It's about planned investments. So customers should be able to say, well, when are you going to replace the roof on my house? When are you going to upgrade it? When is it going to be retrofitted? And I suspect that many housing associations will struggle to answer those questions they will provide answers, but with caveats in terms of this is based on the information available to us at the time and our budgetary constraints, etc. So I think I'm not sure it's going to give the trust and the confidence that if you live in the spirit of transparency, that gives. And I've seen that in my previous life when I worked in the private sector. I think it's going to drive more and more complaints because people are going to see more And it's just going to snowball because they're going to say, well, hang on a minute. How did you know that was the right thing? Where's the justification for this? And I think it's going to put pressure.
And that's the thing, 'cause you're saying you're coming from the private sector, and but you've had this background within the housing sector.
Mm.
You wouldn't, coming back against the service charge as well and the transparency that's needed. If you had to stand in front of a board who held you accountable, you wouldn't just be and if you had customers who could, were trapped. If I was selling mobile phones and my customer was into me for 30 years, well, I would put the price up. I'd remove their data allowances and whatnot because I could. They were signed into a contract. And I do think there's this approach within the housing association world where they go, well, nobody's pushing back on my figures. I'm not held accountable for any of these issues, as I've previously harped on about. And I don't have to stand in front of a board who want answers. As long as I'm paying the bills and passing that charge on to residents. What
Yeah.
can we learn from the private sector? From someone who's had both feet in both ponds, what can we learn from the private sector? And why aren't
So probably 15 years ago, I started out as a property administrator working for the block management arm of a London estate agency. And from day one, I was sent off on some ARMA. What was ARMA now is the Property Institute, rolled in with the IRPM on their training courses. And they run some really good training courses. You get taught what is a lease, what is a service charge, how do you budget, how do you stay out of court? That's what you're taught, because there's a huge amount in the private sector, there's a huge amount of case law around service charges. There's not so much in the social housing sector. And I think that is indicative of, the financial resources that people have in the social housing world, financially vulnerable. I can't stress that enough. So you don't see as much litigation and people don't know how to access the recourse. And I've worked on central London portfolios where leaseholders are barristers. They've got the means, they've got the know-how, and they will go up to the Supreme Court if they have to and they feel passionately enough about it. But in social housing, you haven't. So my training was always act like you're going to end up in front of the judge. Act as though you've got to defend this and defend it to your client. Your client you're an agent of your client. They set out the rules in which you operate. And if you've got to spend more than the expenditure limit, you go back to them and you tell them why and you justify it. And so that was always my approach. We've got to renew the roof because we've tried patching it 3 times. It's not holding. It's the end of its life. Shall we just get on and do this? And the risks if you don't are X, Y, Z. And I think that set me in really good stead. And actually, I'm really proud of I've only been in the first tier tribunal once, and it was on a service charge dispute with a leaseholder who we'd just taken over the management of his building. They'd kicked the old agent out, they were unhappy, and we turned up and said, look, we need to put this building on the right footing. And we had to increase the service charges. Now, this was a block of flats in Wimbledon in South London, and the service charge went up significantly because it was a 1970s building, the lifts were failing, the roof was failing. But the reality was nobody put money aside in the reserve fund. So we had to build that reserve fund back up. We did it in consultation with the residents. But one leaseholder, and I remember him quite fondly actually, he sent me lots and lots of letters and we sent lots and lots of letters back. I even went to his house and he offered me a whiskey at 10 o'clock in the morning to try and avoid going to the court. But he was hell-bent on having his day in court, and I think he needed it because he needed to understand that we weren't just trying to rip him off. And we got to court. We actually won because the judge agreed, yes, you've gone through the right process, you've brought in surveyors, they've confirmed these costs are due. And I can see that now. I think he possibly could have had a case if he'd have argued, well, hang on, have I had value for money? But he didn't. And that was for him to bring. But he came out of a tribunal and he shook our hand and he paid the money the next day. And I think that was testament to actually engaging with him. The rest of the residents were supportive, but he just needed to hear it from a judge. And actually, fine, it was a worthwhile exercise. But that approach is rarely taken. And I think I was a property manager and I did everything from chase arrears to go out on site and check and look for leaks and specify works and engage. I was in control of everything. So I could have conversations and instill that trust because I knew what was going on. I knew when the lifts were due their service. I knew when the fire safety risk assessment was due. The trouble is when you get into these huge organisations, local authorities, housing associations, it is siloed and fragmented. And so the person who should be able to answer the questions can't. And they can't because they haven't got access to the information. So you kind of spiral into this distrust. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You get a different answer from one team, and it becomes very complex and unnecessary. I think if we could take a step back and just understand where things are and put some people around the structures that exist in these organizations to support them to answer those questions and to really get under the skin of things, I think that would be a step ahead, but also acknowledging where there has potentially been mismanagement, because how on earth can you prove that you've managed a building if you can't even answer the simple question of when is the lift next due its service, or how can you demonstrate that you've maintained that lift to avert, failure, early failure. So I think there's a bit more reckoning to be done in that area.
I agree. And, I've had my own legal issues with my own landlord. And when I did, first of all, the Freedom of Information Act request, I remember a boss saying to me years ago, I'd sent him an email about a client that we were cutting ties with. And I'd been rude about this particular person. And Alistair Cook came straight over to me and went, "Would you read that out in court?" And I went, "Oh, God, no." And he went, "Then don't put it in an email."
Yeah.
And that seems to be a thing that they've coming back to your point about, nobody having the answers. And I think this is where I've been overcritical of teams of my own landlord. It's because, hang on, I'm asking what's a reasonable and simple question, and it cannot be answered. And I
Yeah.
do suspect that's from the multiple mergers, and we now know through the information I've gathered that, someone's over here. Oh, Sheila used to do that, but now she's left. Oh,
Yeah.
Barry was responsible for that, but he's on holiday, so we can't get in that. And nobody knows. And then rather than them admitting that they don't know, it is easier for a landlord because of the reasons you said, well, we'll just take you to court, because we've got the big guns. And, when I was in court, it was me and my wife sat on a bench and they had a room with your speaker phone, and they were talking to multiple
Yeah.
people at different things. And thought, well, hang on, this isn't stacked in our favour. And they do so often now go, well, if you don't like it, take us to court. And then they threatened one of my neighbours with eviction before Christmas. Well, if you're not going to pay your service charge, we'll evict you and you'll lose everything. This is a week before Christmas with
Yeah.
kids. So we have now this combative nature. And this is the issue, that Shaq has. Well, we've not been heard. We've not been listened. So we're going to get louder and louder and louder. Where's it going to end? And in all honesty, I have reached out to my landlord on multiple occasions going, look, should we not step back and have a conversation? And they never respond.
I mean,
But that is something they could find. Look, we're getting on with time. Thank you very much indeed. So look, let's talk about, you've gotten into this because of some sort of leasehold reform that you're pushing for. Is that correct?
well, I think that the government are pushing for. So there's the whole thing about ground rents.
Yep. Sorry, that was my notes. I've aligned that to you and your
Oh,
fright.
yes. Well, yes, I am. Sorry. I support it. So
Right.
yes, absolutely. You've got the whole, the ground rents, the forfeiture provisions, which are draconian, and, being evicted from your home for £350 arrears is
Yeah.
not a very high bar, is it? And you've also got the advent of common hold, which does exist, but I think only about 2% of developments have that in place. I think it's more common in Scotland. So again, all these reforms doesn't yet touch freeholders on private estates where you've got unadopted roads. So we have this kind of disparity. It's still in terms of how people can access address or redress and get their questions answered. So I think it's positive. There's a hell of a lot going on through government at the moment. Whether people see that, I think will really depend on whether people are willing to accept, say property owners are willing to accept, well, hang on a minute, could we have done better? But I think until it's spelt out for them, they're going to be taking that sort of quite defensive approach and aggressive approach because it's the playbook.
It is
And
a playbook. Yeah.
yeah, and there's a lot, like I said earlier, there's a lot. I worked for a private family office. They had about £4 billion worth of property, commercial, residential, and they wrote a lot of that case law. But they had deep pockets, and it was a point of principle. It was also because the impact on their portfolio would have been massive, so they had to defend it. But as you well know, litigation is not for the faint-hearted, and it really, the courts can't cope with it. So,
Well, shouldn't
there
have
has,
to.
they shouldn't, and there is another way, and I think, I go back to my one example. I've been to the housing ombudsman once, myself personally, where I've been managing property, and the first tier tribunal once in my whole career, and I've managed a lot of property, I'm quite proud of that, because I think it shows that actually you have to try and resolve things. You have to sit down with people, and you have to be really frank and honest and say, I've delivered some really tricky, difficult sort of responses to people. But if you're telling them the truth, if you're leveling with them and saying, this is what I can do and this is what I can't do, and this is why, but this is what I'm going to do for you, you get a lot more back, and you
Yeah.
actually pull forward. And I have to say, there's one group of residents who I worked with closely. They had a very difficult situation with their building. The communal heating system was failing, had defects. The whole bit development was riddled. Developers gone bust, disappeared. Very serious issues, and they were stuck. And we held their hand and we advocated for them. And I think that's the role that housing associations should be playing, particularly where you've got these complex structures of ownership where the housing association might be in the middle and is being done too, and then their customers, all they can do is complain, and it all gets very messy. But that's where housing associations should step up and be a professional landlord and really advocate and set the tone and
Yeah.
say, this is the standard that we are aspiring to. You are nowhere near it. Do better. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean that's some ringing of truth there, and that is another frustration. We get the promotion and all the puff pieces. Oh, here's how we're doing really well, and you think not from the lived experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do forget that they're a middle piece. Do you think that with the mergers and housing associations becoming bigger and bigger, they move further away from their communities? We haven't seen a housing officer around here. We've had no engagement other than defensive emails, which they have to respond to. That's the sort of crux of the relationship at the minute. We have the puff pieces on Facebook here and LinkedIn. Here, we're doing great. And all we get is defensive emails. Oh, we didn't do, you should have done this, you should have done that.
Yeah.
How do we rebuild that relationship? Do we need to come back into the communities? Do we need to cap the size of housing associations so they are small and focused on the communities that they're serving?
I mean, having national footprints, managing national portfolios is tricky. I've done it in the private sector and in the housing association sector. It can be done. Having regional teams, local teams, that's good because it's good for local communities. You're doing something in the community where you live. It's good for residents because they've got somebody who understands the locality, that understands the contractors in the area. Have they got too big? I think so, when you're kind of pushing over 100,000 units, probably yes, especially if you're set up and you're doing it really, really well, and you've got all the systems, the processes in place, ready, and you do a merger where it's properly considered and there's a proper transition period. I think it can, but I haven't seen that yet. I've acquired portfolios and retained the I used to work for a for-profit, and we would buy up shared ownership portfolios. And we knew we weren't set up to manage. We were a startup effectively. So we would work with the disposing housing association and say, look, how about you retain the management, and we'll continue paying you. Nothing changes for the residents. That's worked really well where you've got really strong management agreements in place. And I hope Ocean won't mind me mentioning their names, but I have to say they're an incredibly professional team down there in Cornwall. And they really impressed me with their ability to actually demonstrate that management and actually give me the assurance as the new landlord, that they were managing our portfolio correctly. And so I think it can be done, but there's got to be that client sort of service provider relationship where you've got somebody who is actually checking and not, and you're not marking your own homework. And actually, when you bring that together and people really embrace it, and I've done it with sales agents, I've done it with managing agents, lettings agents, it can be a really strong partnership, but you've got to get the right sort of principles in place. You've got to have the right reporting. You've got to have the right expectations. And you've got to make sure that you're going into it and they're pricing it fairly. You know, we wanted some extras that they weren't doing. And they said it's going to cost more money. I said, that's fine because I want a decent service.
Yeah, let's be honest about the cost up front. And of course, mergers aren't usually, one successful and one that they're two failing organizations who haven't got everything aligned,
Yeah. Yeah.
desperately clinging on to each other so the stronger will survive. And it's a
Yeah.
battle, survival of the fittest. Hannah, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for giving up your time on a Sunday morning. For everyone out there, we record these on a Sunday morning because I work all week because I don't take any money out of the sector. Hannah, thank you very much indeed. It's been great talking to you. Stay in touch,
Cheers, Ben.
and yeah, keep up the great work. And thank you for your input today. It's been really, really quite insightful. Thank you.
You're welcome. No, thanks for having me.